On a seemingly peaceful night in November 2007, the tranquility of a quiet neighborhood in southeast Wichita, Kansas, was shattered by a crime so horrifying it would send shockwaves through the community and beyond. This wasn't just any ordinary neighborhood. This was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings, believing they were safe from the evils of the world. But on this fateful evening, that false sense of security was ripped apart in an instant. The scene of the crime, a modest home near Harry and Greenwich streets, a place that should have been a refuge, a sanctuary, but that night it became the epicenter of a nightmare. Inside the home, a woman, alone, vulnerable, and completely unaware of the danger creeping toward her, was about to endure an unimaginable horror. Her husband, a brave serviceman stationed overseas, had no idea that the safety of his wife, his most cherished loved one, was about to be violated in the most brutal way. It was late in the evening, and darkness had enveloped the streets. But it wasn't just the cover of night that aided the assailant. It was his meticulous planning. Ted Foy, the man who would soon be identified as the perpetrator of this vicious crime, wasn't acting on impulse. This was a premeditated assault, cold and calculated. Foy, dressed entirely in black, his face obscured by a mask, moved like a shadow through the neighborhood. He had studied his prey, learning the routines, the vulnerabilities, the very layout of the house he was about to invade. In a chilling twist, Foy entered the home through a downstairs window, a detail that suggests he had scouted the property beforehand. This wasn't the work of an amateur. It was the act of someone who had planned every move, ensuring that nothing would stand in his way. Once inside, the stage was set for terror. The woman, completely unaware of the predator lurking in her home, suddenly found herself face to face with a nightmare. What happened next is difficult to imagine, but the brutal reality is that Foy restrained and assaulted the woman in a manner so savage it would leave psychological scars that would take years to heal, if ever. And in a heart-wrenching twist, as this unspeakable crime unfolded, her husband, serving his country thousands of miles away, was helpless to protect her. The terror of the attack was not only physical but emotional, as her sense of safety, trust, and peace was violently ripped away. But what led Ted Foy to this moment? How did a man, capable of such evil, go unnoticed for so long? This was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out investigation, filled with frustration, dead ends, and a chilling revelation years later that would leave everyone wondering how such a monster could have walked among them unnoticed. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. So, an extensive investigation is immediately launched by the Wichita Police Department, with the crime scene thoroughly processed, and key pieces of evidence, including DNA from the attacker, had been collected. However, despite the careful gathering of forensic evidence, the case quickly ran into significant roadblocks. The DNA sample did not match any known offenders in the national criminal databases, leaving investigators without a clear suspect. For years, detectives combed through potential leads. They interviewed neighbors, combed through the victim's social circle, and attempted to trace any possible connections between the woman and her assailant. However, every avenue led to a dead end. The attack had appeared random, with no discernible motive or connection between the victim and the perpetrator, making it difficult for investigators to pinpoint any particular suspect. This period of investigation was filled with frustration and dead ends. The police had the DNA evidence, but nothing to match it against. This was before the widespread use of forensic genealogy, so detectives were unable to utilize the innovative methods that would eventually break the case wide open years later. The victim, left traumatized by the assault, faced the emotional burden of an unsolved case. For her, there was no closure, and the thought of her attacker still being out there was a constant source of fear and anxiety. For investigators, it was a lingering cold case, one of many unsolved crimes that haunted the Wichita Police Department. The case was eventually shelved, leaving the victim and her family in a state of limbo. In 2023, nearly 16 years after the brutal assault, the cold case took an unexpected turn, thanks to advancements in forensic science, specifically the relatively new field of investigative genetic genealogy. This revolutionary method of solving cold cases had been growing in popularity after its use in several high-profile cases, including the identification of the Golden State Killer. The Wichita Police Department, like many other law enforcement agencies, had begun to explore the potential of this technique in unsolved cases. In this case, the DNA sample collected from the victim's body during the initial investigation was re-examined using forensic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which compares DNA to criminal databases, forensic genealogy uses public genealogical databases, where people voluntarily submit their DNA for ancestry testing. This allows investigators to trace familial connections and identify potential suspects through distant relatives who may have uploaded their genetic information online. The DNA sample from the 2007 assault was submitted, and investigators were able to match it to a family tree. Through careful analysis and genetic tracing, they narrowed their suspect pool and finally identified Ted Foy as the likely perpetrator. Foy's identity was further confirmed through additional DNA testing, leaving no doubt that he was the man responsible for the assault in southeast Wichita. Foy had lived in relative obscurity for years, blending into society while his crime remained unsolved. At the time of his arrest, he was living in Augusta, Kansas, a small town not far from the scene of the crime. The breakthrough in DNA technology had finally caught up to him, bringing his hidden past into the light. In May 2023, after nearly 16 years of living under the radar, authorities finally closed in on Ted Foy. The man who had terrorized an innocent woman and shattered her life back in 2007 was now within their grasp. The Augusta resident, who had managed to live quietly for over a decade, blending into society, was swiftly apprehended. His arrest marked a turning point, not only in the investigation, but in the victim's journey toward justice. Foy was taken into custody, and what followed was a series of intense interrogations. Imagine the scene: police officers, seasoned detectives who had worked on countless cases, sitting face to face with a man who had evaded them for so long. And yet, as they questioned him, Foy didn't falter. He didn't show any signs of guilt or remorse. Instead, he calmly laid out the details of his calculated crime, as if recounting an ordinary event. This cold, emotionless confession would later haunt both investigators and the victim's family. As part of a plea deal that spared him the rigors of a full trial, Foy revealed the chilling methods behind his crime. He admitted to carefully selecting his victim, stalking her for days, possibly weeks, watching her every move. The thought that this predator had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, is nothing short of terrifying. Foy confessed to observing the woman's routines, knowing exactly when she would be most vulnerable. And the key detail? Her husband was away, serving his country in the military, a fact that made her isolated, an easy target. Foy described how he chose a moment when the house was dark and quiet, a night when no one would notice him slipping through the window. His entry wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was premeditated, meticulously planned. With each word he spoke, Foy revealed more about his calculated nature, and as those details came to light, the horror of that November night in 2007 only deepened. It wasn't just a random attack. It was a deliberate, malicious act by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Foy's confession was his complete lack of remorse. As he described the brutal assault, there was no apology, no regret. He spoke with chilling detachment, a predator who had carried out his crime without a second thought. For the victim and her family, this revelation was like reopening an old wound, forcing them to relive the trauma, but this time with a fuller understanding of the darkness that had invaded their lives. Yet, in this darkness, there was a glimmer of relief. Foy's confession meant that the victim would not have to endure the ordeal of a trial. The long, drawn-out court proceedings that could have re-traumatized her were avoided. Instead, the details of the crime, horrific as they were laid bare, offering her some sense of closure, if only by finally knowing the truth. With Foy's confession in hand, the prosecution wasted no time. The case, which had languished for so many years, now moved swiftly toward its conclusion. Foy was charged with multiple counts: aggravated criminal sodomy, rape, aggravated sexual battery, and attempted rape. The severity of the charges reflected the gravity of the crime, and though his guilty plea meant avoiding a trial, it ensured that justice would be served. Fast forward to August 2024. After months of legal procedures, the day of reckoning finally arrived. Ted Foy appeared in court before Sedgwick County District Judge Christopher Magana, where he faced the consequences of his monstrous actions. The courtroom, heavy with emotion, was filled with those who had waited nearly 16 years for this moment. The victim, now older but forever scarred by what had happened, was there, stronger than before, but undoubtedly still carrying the weight of that horrific night. Foy had pleaded guilty in March 2024, sparing himself the possibility of a harsher sentence. Yet, the charges against him were nothing short of severe: aggravated criminal sodomy, rape, aggravated sexual battery, and attempted rape. When Judge Magana delivered the sentence, 310 months in prison, just shy of 26 years, it was a moment of both justice and bittersweet relief. For the victim and her family, the sentencing brought a sense of closure, but it could never erase the trauma that had haunted them for nearly 2 decades. As the courtroom quieted down, there was a palpable sense of finality. The nearly 26-year sentence ensured that Foy would spend a significant portion of his life behind bars. For the woman he had victimized, this marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could finally begin to heal, knowing her attacker was no longer a free man. But beyond the sentencing, Foy's guilty plea revealed something far more sinister. He had chosen his victim deliberately. He knew where she lived, he knew she would be alone, and he exploited her vulnerability without a second thought. This wasn't a crime of passion or circumstance. It was the methodical, predatory behavior of a man who had evaded justice for years. In the end, Foy's imprisonment wasn't just about one case. It set a precedent. It showed the power of modern forensic technology and the persistence of law enforcement in never giving up on justice. With his arrest and conviction, other victims of cold cases around the country gained hope that their day of justice might come too, and so the case of Ted Foy, once thought destined to remain unsolved, finally came to a close. But even as justice was served and the long-awaited answers were revealed, the emotional scars left behind by that horrifying night in November 2007 remain a lasting reminder of the darkness that sometimes hides in plain sight, lurking in the most unsuspecting places. But here's something to think about. How many more cases like this might still be out there, waiting for breakthroughs like forensic genealogy to finally bring justice to victims who've suffered in silence for years? And what do you think about the chilling nature of premeditated crimes like this one? How do we, as a society, even begin to prevent these kinds of predators from slipping through the cracks? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think advancements in DNA technology will lead to more cold cases being solved? Or is there something even deeper at play in cases like these that we should be more aware of? We want to hear your take. And if you found this case as gripping as we did, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into true crime cases like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and join us next time as we continue to uncover the mysteries behind the crimes that shook the world.